As the brilliant colors of fall fade, when vivid hues gradually disappear, leaves blow away, branches that clung onto them tightly begin to loosen their collective grip. As nature signals impending changes, as the gospel says, the days grow shorter and colder, and yet another cycle in the drama that is life and death is about to take place. And so it is with the church. The church year is coming to an end. Next week is the last Sunday of the church year, the Feast of Christ the King, the end of the year. This is the last Sunday that we will see green. I can get them cleaned, at least for a couple of months. And just as green, which is the color of hope, gives way to violet, the color of expectation and preparation, so are we drawn into the continuance of the cycle of renewal and birth, which is very important for us who believe, for us who are disciples. This came to mind for me very clearly on Friday, November 16th. Friday was the 29th anniversary of the assassination of the Jesuits in El Salvador. And this became very poignant this year because of the canonization of Archbishop Oscar Romero last month, which is part of the chain of events that I think started in 1977. 1977, Jesuit Father Rutilio Grande was the first priest assassinated before the Civil War in El Salvador. Rutilio Grande was a good friend of Oscar Romero, and his death had a profound impact on Romero, who presided at Rutilio Grande's funeral, where he met streams of campesinos, farmers, simple folk, who had come to mourn their priest, who had been their voice. The following Sunday, Archbishop Romero declared a single Mass, meaning a memorial Mass for Rutilio Grande at the cathedral in San Salvador was the only Mass celebrated in the country that Sunday. It was a move that drew criticism from some church officials, but more than 150 priests joined the Mass as celebrants, and over 100,000 people came to the cathedral to hear Romero's address, which called for an end to violence. The next morning, after meeting with his priests and advisors, Archbishop Romero announced that he would not attend any state occasions, nor meet with the president, both traditional activities of his longtime predecessor, until Rutilio Grande's death was investigated. As no investigation was ever conducted, the decision meant that Romero attended no state occasions whatsoever in his 3 years as Archbishop of San Salvador. Romero himself would be assassinated in 1980 while celebrating Mass in the Hospital of Divine Providence in San Salvador. To this day, no one has been convicted for the crime, which was supposed to silence the voice of the poor in El Salvador. Romero had actively denounced violations of human rights of the most vulnerable people and defended the principle of protecting lives, promoting human dignity, and opposing all forms of violence. After Romero's death in 1980, his mantle was taken up by the University of Central America, popularly known as the UCA, which became a center for the promotion of peace and justice in the country. The Jesuits who ran the UCA took up Romero's charge, and they were advocates of a negotiated settlement between the government of El Salvador and the FMLN rebels. The murder of the Jesuits attracted international attention to their efforts and increased international pressure for a ceasefire, representing one of the key turning points that led to a negotiated settlement of the war. The Salvadoran army had considered the pastoral center of the UCA a refuge for subversives, and the Minister of Defense had publicly accused the Jesuits of being the center of operations for the FMLN rebels. On the morning of November 16, 1989, 29 years ago, an elite battalion of Salvadoran army officers entered the grounds of the UCA with orders to kill Father Ignacio Ellacuria, an outspoken critic of the military dictatorship, and to leave no witnesses. When it was all over, the soldiers had killed 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and her 15-year-old daughter. Most of them had been dragged from their beds and shot in the head with high-powered rifles. Friday would have been an ordinary commemoration for me, 29th anniversary, the anniversary of the assassination of my brothers. But on Thursday night, we got news that Father Victor Luke Odhiambo was killed earlier that morning in the Jesuit community in Shebei, in South Sudan. The unknown assailants broke into the residence in an apparent robbery, although the motives are still unclear. The other Jesuits in the community were unharmed, but deeply shaken. Victor Luke, who I knew, went to South Sudan after the peace agreement in 2005, which later led to South Sudanese independence. He was one of several Jesuits who helped restart the Jesuit school in Wau that had previously been taken over by the military. Since then, he gave his whole life in ministry to the people of South Sudan. But this is just the Jesuits. There are many, many other religious and lay women and men who have given their lives in the service of God and His church in the same quest for peace and justice. Because sometimes, brothers and sisters, the price of discipleship is very high. We're simply not talking about going to church every Sunday and saying a few prayers once in a while. Sometimes being a disciple means giving up your very self, because you give it up for something bigger, something greater, something that is beyond you, just as Jesus did. And we're not talking about a martyrdom in first century Rome with Christians being fed to lions. We're talking here of modern-day events. Rutilio Grande was murdered in 1977. The Jesuits in El Salvador murdered in 1989. Victor was murdered on Thursday. That's very recent. In some cases, these are Christians killing other Christians. Maybe this is the tribulation that Mark mentions in today's gospel, because sometimes that's what it feels like. In those days, Mark says, after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from the sky, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. When I lose hope, when bad news overwhelms me, when I wonder what is going on in the world and why we sometimes treat fellow human beings as worthless, when we shoot each other and we build walls to keep each other away, I wonder how we can ever say that any of this is God's will. And then I remember that we, human beings, we are finite, sinful creatures. We are not perfect. We need grace. We need God's help. We are completely reliant on something that is other than us. That God is bigger than any of this, than any of the tragedies of our human existence. The prophecy of Daniel from the first reading is about God taking care of the people, of us. Even in times that are, as Daniel said, unsurpassed in distress, God takes care of God's people because God is with us. Because those who sleep shall awake, and some of them shall live forever, Daniel says. And in the midst of all of this is a God who labors on our behalf. And that, brothers and sisters, is good news. That God is with us, that God labors for us, and that God is always in our midst. Good news, something we can use a lot more of in these days.